Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, what archaeology can teach us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of archaeology in the Middle East to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Larry Garrity, former president of La Sierra University, and you have just stayed around, and you continue
They can't get rid of me.
No, and we don't want them to either. And your role is so significant as associate director of the center, and helping us stay on board here financially. So that's been extremely helpful. And our guest, whom we can't call guest because he's here for all of these episodes that we're doing,
right,
walking through the Bible and archaeology. Dr. Kent Bramlett, also from La Sierra University, Associate Professor of Archaeology and the History of Antiquity. We have been, I'm going to use the title of the book, Walking the Bible. We've been walking through the Bible, and beginning in Genesis, we've taped a number of episodes from Genesis all the way through the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, and into Joshua, Judges, and the beautiful story of Ruth. And now there's a transition. Now we turn to what are commonly called the history books. One thinks about 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. We'll look at these and we'll talk about them in a minute. They've been given a name, especially Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. They've been given a name by scholars. What is that, and where can that lead us? How can it help us understand these books, these history books, better?
Well, the theology behind all these books of history derives from the book of Deuteronomy, it's thought. So the German scholars called it Heilgeschichte because that meant it was a sacred history. Yes. And so while it is history, and we can relate it to the history that we know from secular sources and from archaeology and so on, the writers of this history had a theological reason for their writing. And so their interest sometimes is different from our interest. We wish they'd say more about certain kings, for instance. And because the kings were wicked kings, they didn't want to talk about them. They wanted to talk about the good kings. So, you know, it's definitely a history, but it's a kind of a history that also has theological ramifications.
So I think that leads to a question. Okay, I'm going to set it up kind of as teachers do sometimes to trick students. So is this collection, and we're thinking about 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings right now, but we include Joshua and Judges. Are these books theology, or are they history, or are they story, or, and we might be able to take off some other possibilities. Which is the which primary category should we use?
Well, I would say and
okay.
For each or.
They're all of those things.
Okay.
Yeah.
If we look even at what Kings Samuel say, they're selecting from the annals of the kings of Israel, the annals of the kings of Judah. And from that we realize they're selecting. And why are they selecting? It's because of the religious narrative that they're portraying. So there's a reason behind it. So primarily, I guess it's a religious history, theology. And it's based on Deuteronomy, which is why people call it the Deuteronomistic or Deuteronomic books.
Right.
And it's based then on trying to explain history through the blessings and curses formulas of Deuteronomy.
In fact, DTR, isn't that the abbreviation that scholars use for the it's a mouthful, but Deuteronomistic history, because it's history that is written in the context of this larger theological theme.
It illustrates what Deuteronomy said was going to happen.
Without question, which then places theology as, okay, is it the primary one? I would argue, I think I'm with you, Ken, on this, that it is central. And you talked about blessings and cursings. I think some scholars have used the language of the act-consequence relation. Obedience leads to success, prosperity, posterity, lots of children, live long, die in peace, have a good funeral, and be buried in your, or, in your home territory. Disobedience leads to the opposite of all of those. And so the actions of obedience or disobedience have consequences. And that is, I mean, that's such a basic underlying principle of a moral universe. I'm getting too philosophical here because they wouldn't have processed it in quite that way, but they would have processed it in a way that said, here's my relationship with God. I want it to be positive. I'm not frightened with the alternatives, but I am reminded, okay, this is where this particular path typically leads.
And they go back to what Moses really remembered Moses said, do these things and you'll live, just as you said, do these things and you'll get into trouble. And so they were always harking back to those sermons that we get in Deuteronomy for looking at the history and how it worked out.
And that's a good way to describe Deuteronomy, as we've talked about it before. These are sermons, and they're a call to a life, a kind of life under God that's responsible, and that will have consequences that are positive. I mean, that's the basic underlying thing. And then, as you said, illustrations. That's what we have, these stories of kings and others. If you want to do like this king, this is what's going to happen. And so we have that kind of thing going on. What basic historical sorts of things are going on? If we start at, well, Joshua Judges, we're talking about getting settled in the land and so on. But let's start with Samuel and Kings. Chronicles is something different. There's another sort of thing going on there. But what sorts of basic strokes of history do we see in these books?
Well, it's state formation, if we look at it historically. And they're not alone. This is when what we call the ethno-states, or the states that sort of are defined by a people that would probably call themselves Israelites or Moabites or Arameans, when these states develop. And so what's happening in Israel is we have the beginning of a monarchy. So what had been a coalition of tribes with lots of internecine warfare and very loose political affiliations.
Where judges would be the
in the judges,
people.
the time of the judges. Now they come together. They say there's safety in numbers. We have enemies, the Philistines down there by the coast of the Mediterranean. It's better to have a leader. There's a win and a lose, I guess, an up and a downside to that. But historically speaking, it was better to be unified.
They wanted it so badly, they said to Samuel, give us a king, right? And he said, now just a minute, if you have a king, he'll take away all your privileges, and he'll force you into taxes, that's right, and servitude and so on. But they still wanted a king. So they got a king, and look what happened.
In a way, that's kind of inevitable, though, because Judges sets up what happens when you don't have a king.
That's true.
So there are these interesting, theo-political or political theological sorts of debates going on, and we see the lines of them, but ultimately there's this one that kind of drives it, and it drives it toward kingdoms.
You might lose a little freedom, but you gain security. People today are choosing that. They would rather have safety than...
And they looked around at all their neighbors, and they had kings, so they wanted kings too.
Okay, in that context, we have Israel, well, we have a united monarchy, a united kingdom, and then a split. And this is the history of these books. So where does it start and where does it end?
We usually think of the 10th century as the time when the united monarchy started, so starting with Saul and David and Solomon, and then it splits in the early 900s. And goes down to 722 is our date for the ending of the northern tribes in what's called Israel. But in the southern tribes, Benjamin and Judah, which is a continuity of the Davidic monarchy, it goes down to the 6th century.
So one of them ends at the hands of an empire,
the
Assyrians. The other one ends at the hands of an empire,
the Babylonians.
the Babylonians. So there's this external control. And I hope that by looking at this whole package, that we might capture something that will then inform us as we're looking at various passages and parts of it. The ending. How does 2 Kings end? What's happening at the end of 2 Kings, which might help us know when, at least you could put the final date of this collection.
Well, it's the exile. It's the end of the kingdom. The Babylonians have come, and
What a terrible, you know, event that was, because they felt like we've really been a failure. And yet it was predicted as they looked back, you know, at Deuteronomy and those sermons there. They could have predicted that we've been involved in idolatry. We haven't lived up to the requirements of the law, and it's gotten us into trouble.
But even then, it doesn't end on that note,
No.
because it ends with what, Jeconiah or Jehoiakim, who is in Babylonian captivity. And the book ends with us watching that last Judean, well, not Zedekiah, but the one in which theologically the leaders placed their hope. And now he is on his way to a better status from prison, still in Babylon, but maybe there is hope. So that the God who calls people to responsibility by the Deuteronomy Code also says, look, I am here for your best, and I'm going to bring hope out of this dismal situation.
I'm a forgiving God as well.
Right, so I
and
think
Deuteronomy contains that hope as well. But if you do turn, or when you turn away, it's almost predictive. Then if you turn back, God will bring you back.
Okay, we want to look at some things, some slides in a moment, but we have some artifacts in front of us. Kent and Larry, talk to us about these.
Well, this series of bowls really tells the sweep of history. I think, Larry, you've sometimes mentioned that from the beginning of the monarchy to the final captivity is about 400 years, give or take, which, if we think in terms of the United States, that's what? Before our country, going back to the Pilgrims' landing.
Pilgrims, right.
So if we take a bowl per century, this would represent, now there's some overlap, of course, it's not, they're not watching the centuries tick off. But look at this bowl. The finish on it is fairly rough. Now it's a bit worn, but there's a process called burnishing that potters began to do as we look down the centuries. Burnishing is rubbing the clay before it's fired to sort of smooth and seal the surface. It's somewhat porous if it's not sealed, like with the burnishing. So this is an unburnished bowl, and we move then into the time of really the 10th century, and you can, if you look at a bowl like this, you can see streaks on it. And
Very
this
clear,
is
isn't it?
hand burnishing. So they took a smooth implement, maybe a flat bone or a smooth stone, and they simply rubbed it around different ways by hand.
It's a sheen.
It is a sheen, but it's very streaky at this point.
Yes. Now, is it decorative and utilitarian?
Well, it's certainly functional, utilitarian, and I think it became decorative because it was better.
Right.
David or Solomon could have handled that bowl, right?
Exactly. People consider this to be sort of classic Solomonic time period wear. With the pottery wheel, they discovered, again, later 10th century, 9th century, that if you burnish it while it's spinning on the wheel, it's much more efficient and you get a more even burnish. So if you were to look closely at this bowl, the burnishing always follows the rotation of the bowl on the potter's wheel. Time of Ahab down into probably the next century. 7th century, they're getting a bit sloppy. Time of Josiah, maybe even Isaiah, a little bit earlier. Again, the burnishing is getting sloppy. They're not very careful anymore. It's funny how usually the earlier forms with a new trend are the best, and then that trend sort of degenerates. They discover a new process that's very well done, and then that degenerates over time.
Larry, what else do we have here?
Well, there's a lamp over here that is very typical of the Iron Age, the period that covers the history of the monarchy
And I think
that
that's
we've been
your
talking
favorite
about.
object,
That's
right?
my favorite object.
Yes.
I enjoy lamps because they bring light, and they're mentioned several times in the Bible, and this particular one would be just the kind that David had in mind when he said that your word is like a light onto my path. He would be thinking of that kind of a lamp. And a little juglet that would be used for water or wine or oil, something like that. That also is from that period. Over here is a chalice and some stone implements that would be used in the house, in the kitchen.
Right.
Yeah.
making some bread, making some
Right,
flour for
right,
bread.
right.
And of course, with stones like this, you get added minerals
You do,
because
don't you?
the stones break apart, and that of course adds to the wear on
Your
people's
teeth.
teeth.
Right.
And archaeologically, we can see that. We see
can,
that
we do.
in burials, and then a sheaf of some wheat. So let's then take a look at some slides that might illustrate what we're talking about. The history books that we normally think about are the ones listed here, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. But as we were talking a bit ago, Samuel and Kings are part of this Deuteronomistic history. Chronicles has been separated out.
They were written. Chronicles was written later with the exile already have taken place. So Chronicles really repeats the history that we have in Samuel and Kings, but does it from the perspective of a Davidic monarchy being reestablished.
Right,
you know.
right.
Yeah.
Now, what we'll do in excavating the Bible is spend time going through 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, but we'll only spend one episode with Chronicles because it does repeat things, and we just want to look for dynamics characteristic of that book. And when you read the parallel accounts, there's added material to give some kind of other spiritual lesson in Chronicles that we don't even have in the earlier books.
And when Chronicles is talking about the same history that Kings is, different numbers are used. And we'll probably talk about that when we get to Chronicles. As we're comparing the stories, the numbers of soldiers and the number of people and so on are different. And so how do we account for that?
Right. Now, I mentioned earlier that, well, I think as we were talking about it, it came out that in Kings, the last event is in the 6th century, maybe 560, something like that. And does that mean then that all of this was saved and written then, or do we have some other dynamic process that's going on?
Well, certainly they refer, whoever authored 1st and 2nd Kings, and there may be multiple authors, they utilized records, royal records, that are referred to. If you want to know more about that, it's in the annals of so-and-so, you know, or in the Chronicles. So they definitely used sources that were contemporaneous to tell their story from their particular point of view.
So that even under inspiration, and we all believe in the inspiration of the Bible, that even under inspiration, various hands, various humans are participating, and there are different steps that we can actually trace. Some of them we can trace quite well. But this is all under this umbrella of inspiration, and we just see the human dimension involved in this as well. Okay, so then we look at some major locations. Kent, we're going to see some slides in a minute of the empires, but just say a word about these empires listed here.
Well, we have significant empires. The Egyptian Empire, always a great civilization, sometimes spilling outside the proper borders of Egypt. Babylon, again, in southern Mesopotamia, what's now southern Iraq, at times dominating the upper Tigris and Euphrates, where the Assyrians found their homeland. And going further east, we have the homeland of the Persians. And again, empires are transitory, and so we have the rise of one great power, which is then succeeded by another. But they write the grand history, the big history.
That's right, that's right. And we will talk about the Assyrians when we can't help but talk about the
Assyrians finish off the northern kingdom of Israel.
That's right.
The Babylonians finish off the kingdom of Judah.
Right. And the Persians
Bring them
set
back.
in place to the process of bringing them back.
That's right.
And then, of course, we have the local states of Israel, Judah, Assyria. We could talk about others too, but
And those are essential. That's the identity and the day-to-day politics of the people that we read about.
Okay. This is your home, Kent.
Yes, I like maps.
Talk to us about
I do like maps.
Well, the map and Egypt.
Right. So Egypt, again, this is the gift of the Nile, according to Herodotus, because all of the population centers are within a couple miles of the Nile River. If you look at a satellite map, we're looking at desert sands just a mile or two away from the Nile River. But Egypt, again, the heartland, we have a capital up here, the time of the pyramids, the Old Kingdom, a long-standing capital up here at Thebes. I say upriver, it's south.
Yes.
People might wonder, but because the Nile flows to the north, Upper Egypt is south. So Luxor and Thebes, this area, the New Kingdom, pharaohs like Ramses and Tutmosis. And at times then they had a southern empire, which was Nubia, what we consider as Sudan, and a northern, they called it a northern empire, Palestine, the southern Levant. Of course, you have to shift over before you go up. And that was very important.
Now, Egypt keeps showing up in the historical books. It's not that it's so dominant. I mean, you know the history better than I do, but they keep coming in, and the inhabitants of Judah keep wanting to depend on them as opposed to turning themselves over to Assyrians and Babylonians.
Right. They don't really have an empire after the point when Israel is established as a monarchy, but they're a political ally at times, a counterweight to the big empires coming down out of the north.
Okay, so let's look at those.
Oh, excellent. Here we are. So Assyria, their capitals usually cluster here along the Tigris River. Ashur, that's the religious capital. And then we have Nineveh, Kalku at times, the political capital. But the Assyrians have this long memory from way back hundreds of years before when they had an empire that reached the Mediterranean coast, and they always wanted to restore that. It was their dream. So beginning in the 900s, the 800s, about the time of the rise of the kings of Judah and Israel, they begin pushing westward, and they start gobbling up these little Aramean states. You can just see the domino effect.
And this is what scholars call the Neo-Assyrian, right?
Right.
Because they are looking back to the
Middle
Golden
Assyrian,
Age.
the Golden Age, the Middle Assyrian.
Their strategy might be repeated right now by ISIS.
Right.
Going the same direction.
Yep, gobbling up territory. And so we're looking here at the expansion of the Assyrian Empire during the time of the 9th century. Shalmaneser the third. The Assyrian Empire then expands under Tiglath-Pileser III, TP3, we like to call him, in abbreviation, and his successors. His successors who then, Tiglath-Pileser III had conquered Damascus, and in 332, by 322, his successors are...
Good, you put that part of the story into a geographical context.
Have conquered Samaria. Judah alone stands as a small island of independence or semi-independence. They have to toe a certain political line, but they are intact as a
But before we
kingdom.
leave the maps, what happens to Judah now?
Well, right. So the Babylonians sort of coalesce, the Assyrian Empire weakens, and they begin pushing up against the Assyrians. And it's really sort of like in World War II where the Russians are withdrawing and the Germans are pushing forward. The Assyrians are trying that, and they keep moving their capital west, trying to survive. In this case, they don't survive, and the Babylonians completely conquer the former Assyrian territories and then push south. And it's Nebuchadnezzar then who captures Jerusalem.
586, 587, something like that. Okay, another kingdom.
And then the succession of empires. The Babylonians only last 50 years as the Neo-Babylonian Empire, 50 plus years. And this time at first it's the Medians, but the Medes, but the Persians are the dominant partner there in the long run. And so the Medes and the Persian Empire pushes west and becomes the largest empire in history for the Middle East up to that point.
So, final map.
Well, this is very important because these are the identities that it developed with the establishment of kings, the centralized government, as tribes came together. The kingdom of Judah and Israel over here. We have the Ammonites, the Moabites here, Edom, although they've expanded a little bit further west here, and the Aramean kingdoms. And we only show one here, but there's a dozen. There's a dozen if you go all the way up into Turkey, what's now Turkey, and a little bit east of independent kingdoms.
Thank you, Kent. Your map responsibilities have concluded.
Okay.
Not being part of the conversation.
Return to my place.
Archaeologically, we think about, at least I think about, these kinds of connections with the history books. Inscriptions. They are so prominent, and they're so dominant, and there are so many of them outside of Israel and lots of them inside too. Lots of excavated sites, artifacts like we have on the table. And then we think about the empires, this movement of rising and falling. And I also wanted to put on here anthropology because there's so much we learn from anthropology and sociology. State development, all of those sorts of things come from those areas of research. And if I could say one word about inscriptions, we talked about their significance and their importance and how we'd like to find more of them archaeologically. I see 4 categories. Inscriptions that we find that are basic general background. Then secondly, inscriptions that are going to be tied to a narrative or something like that. Thirdly, direct names. We've got bunches of those, and they're from this time period.
Right.
They're from the historical books, and then archaeological discoveries of inscriptions that actually are the Bible. So, this one. What is this stone?
This is the largest inscription that has ever been found in the country of Jordan. So on the east bank, it's the oldest royal inscription that we have. And it relates, as the text says there, the 9th century, to a passage in Kings. So it's interesting that we have the biblical account of the same battles and period as we have in the Mesha Stela, the Moabite. And it's interesting to compare and contrast these. So we know the concerns of both groups from reading their material.
And we know the theology of both groups.
That's right.
That our God is really the best and strongest God, but our God let you, because of disobedience, go into the hands of the other God. But, you know, we're strong enough, we can pull you back. So these are from different perspectives, different readings. Kent.
Here's your TP.
Oh, yes.
TP3.
TP3. Right. We have his court documents. But in one case, he mentions receiving tribute from, among others, the king of Damascus and Menachem, if I can use the Hebrew pronunciation, Menahem of Samaria.
Right. So we have specific names.
References.
So we went to broad biblical story connections now to name connections. And the Babylonian Chronicle.
You know, this is from the standpoint of the Babylonians. They kept a day-by-day or week-by-week account of what they were doing and what they were involved with. So it's so interesting to compare this to what Kings says about the demise of the Israelites and the Judeans.
And I think, Kent, we have a brick, a Nebuchadnezzar brick.
Yes, we do. An individual donated to the museum.
Right. So we have several, and we have other kinds. We won't have time to talk about all of them. A very poignant letter about just before the destruction by the Babylonians of Judah. And so, I mean, these give us so many interesting insights. And I want to thank you for working through this particular episode, this broad sweep episode, Larry and Kent. And all of you, thank you for joining us. We hope that this program has provided something for you to think about and something for your faith. And we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.